thank you, everyone. This is Danya Craddock, co-owner of the Doc Bookshop, and you are here today on DocLive.tv. We are happy to bring you an exciting show today, so gather, share this live with your friends. So we're going to give everybody a minute to come in as I introduce the Doc Bookshop to the family and the community, to our new viewers as well as our existing viewers. So we are happy that you are here with us today. I have some wonderful guests. This has been an amazing week for Malcolm X Centennial Celebration. We celebrating 100th year, his 100th birthday. We kicked off with the Malcolm X Memorial Foundation with the executive director. As I shared before to my weekly listeners, that you guys know I am from Omaha, Nebraska, probably about 10 minutes. Our residence was 10 minutes away from Malcolm X's birthplace. So we just celebrating it across Omaha, and Omaha just recently elected their first African American mayor. So it has been a tremendous year for doing work in Omaha, Nebraska and the Dallas-Fort Worth market. We have been so excited. And thank you to all the support for the native Omahans in Texas. And for those that are new to our platform, again, I want to say this is Danya Craddock, co-owner of the Doc Bookshop. The Doc Bookshop is a family-owned and operated full-service bookstore in Dallas-Fort Worth. The mission of the Doc Bookshop is to inspire, inform, and educate customers through books and book-related events in our environment, in our relaxing environment, as well as our social platform. Again, I have two amazing guests today that's going to hold a conversation, and that is Patrick Oliver and Mark Whitaker to discuss his new book. But before we bring that up, I am going to say that Patrick Oliver is a literary education consultant dedicated to promoting reading and writing as tools of empowerment through a variety of innovative projects. And thank you so much. Patrick has been with us for probably every month since the African American Readers. So we just really love his support. Patrick Oliver engages in children, youth, and adults in activities such as writing workshops, virtual series, author talks, book discussion, you name it, Patrick is on it. And our special guest today is Mark Whitaker. He is a former editor of Newsweek and the first African American to lead a national news weekly. He then served as the Washington bureau chief for NBC News and managing editor of CNN Worldwide. Whitaker's memoir, My Long Trip Home, was a finalist for the Los Angeles Book Prize. His social history, Smoketown, ooh, we love that one. That was great. Smoketown, the Untold Story of other great Black Renaissance, and Saying It Loud, 1966, the year Black Power challenged the civil rights movement, and were named among the best nonfiction books of the year by the Washington Post. We welcome both of these gentlemen to our platform. Are you guys there?
We're here. Thank you.
I am going to be
here.
Huh? What was that, Patrick? Are you ready, Patrick? I am getting ready to turn the moderation over to you. Is he still in his delay?
I'm all set and ready to.
Yes, you are all ready to start the conversation. The afterlife of Malcolm X, an outcast turned icon during an impact on America. So is he? I guess he's going to pop back. Okay, Mark, I'm going to go ahead and start the conversation. He's going to pop back in. Hopefully, he'll get a chance to hear us and get ready to join in on the conversation.
I'm here. I'm not sure why we have these technical difficulties. I may need to switch over to my phone sometimes. Sometimes my phone works better than the laptop. This technology is unique. But first of all, I want to say thank you for the Doc Bookshop, Donna and Danya, for doing this work that they've been doing for a number of years. I mean, just outstanding work. I consider them trailblazers. I also consider them innovators for the work they do at the bookstore. bookstore, and I shouldn't even call it a bookstore, it's a cultural center, the work they've been doing for years. So shout out to you for, again, being an innovator and putting this talk together today for our community. And I'm excited about it, to be able to talk to one of our great journalists of our time, Mark Whitaker. So Mark, thank you so much for being in tune with what we're doing here in Texas, and what Donna and her sister are doing in Fort Worth, because again, they're trailblazers. They're making it happen. So thank you, Mark, for being a
thank you for
part of
having me.
this.
I am going to exit the stage, but I am telling you guys, family, this is going to be an amazing conversation. I think this is probably one of the top conversations of the week. We are with an author, a journalist with a great work, great research, and it is a lot of pressure, you guys, if you don't know, to interview a journalist, because they know they know their work, they know the principles and the best practices. So give us a pass, you guys. Okay, thank you, and I'm going to turn it over to you, Patrick. Out.
Thank you, Nanya.
Hey, Mark, she added to the pressure when she said that, but thank you again so much for joining us. And she mentioned, family and history. Mark, if you don't mind, I met you a long time ago. I interviewed you when you did your memoir. I was a radio station in Little Rock, Arkansas, KABF's community radio station, and you gave me an opportunity to interview you about your memoir. So thank you for that. And very quickly, we're from the South. We always like to know a little bit about where people are from and their background, and kind of what got you into, the journalism field, into literature, that initial spark.
Well, I was born outside of Philadelphia, and my parents were college professors. And we moved around a lot. My parents eventually got divorced when I was 8 years old. I moved with my mom and my younger brother to a small town south of Boston, where my mom taught at a college called Wheaton College. My father grew up in Pittsburgh. He was born and raised in Pittsburgh. His parents, my grandparents, were undertakers, and my grandfather was born in Texas, in a little town called Jewett, Texas.
Okay.
So I have Texas roots. And yeah, I actually did, one of the things I'm doing these days, in addition to writing books, is I'm a contributing correspondent to CBS Sunday Morning. And I did a piece a few years ago for Juneteenth, where I went back. I knew that my grandfather, Frank Whitaker, my great-great-grandfather, Frank Whitaker, was buried in Jewett. But I had never been there. So for the show, we found his gravestone in a black cemetery off the beaten track in Jewett. And then I discovered that, my grandfather was one of 11 children, and I think 2 or 3 of them came north in the Great Migration around World War I. But his other siblings stayed in Texas, and they had children, and then they had children. So I discovered that I had far more Texas relatives than I do Pittsburgh relatives or relatives anyplace else in the country on the Whitaker paternal side of my family. So I consider myself, well, I don't know. I can't. You can tell me. Maybe I'm an honorary Texan.
There you go. We'll claim it today. How about that?
Okay, all right. For today, I'm proud to have those.
All right, honorary Texan. So I'm really excited about the book, the celebration of Malcolm X on his 100th birthday. Obviously, the whole country is excited about it, and I'm excited about it. It's almost 100th anniversary, and it's so nice to have this opportunity to celebrate him on his 100th birthday, because I think it gives a new generation of young people, as well as adults, an opportunity to relook at Malcolm and rethink Malcolm. And just kind of tell us about your intent for the book. I saw a number of interviews, but I just want you to share with our folks here in Texas, because I love the afterlife. I love the term icon as well. All that is a tremendous celebration of who Malcolm is.
So I wrote. What happened was I wrote a book about my well, first I wrote the memoir that you read. It's called My Long Trip Home, and I did a lot of research. I visited Pittsburgh all the time and stayed in touch. Even after my parents got divorced, I was very close with my grandmother in particular, and my aunts and my cousins in Pittsburgh. But I hadn't realized until I did the reporting for that book what a rich history that community had, through the Pittsburgh Courier and the great Negro League baseball teams and all the, fabulous jazz musicians who grew up in Pittsburgh. So that was my book called Smoketown. Then I had done a lot of reporting for that book about Pittsburgh in the Civil Rights era and the Black Power era. But in the end, I didn't include it in that book for various reasons. But I decided that the next book I wanted to write was about that era. And so I wrote a book called Saying It Loud, which was about the birth of Black Power in 1966 and the sort of shift from the sort of King era of civil rights to, the sort of Black Power phase. And what I discovered, even though I was focusing on 1966, and Malcolm X had been assassinated in early 1965, he still loomed over that year. He was in the heads of all the leaders of that movement. So Stokely Carmichael, when he took over for John Lewis at the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, Huey Newton and Bobby Seale, and Eldridge Cleaver, when they founded the Black Panther Party in Oakland, California, Ron Karenga, the nationalist leader who founded Kwanzaa, the early advocates of Black studies at San Jose State University. And so even before I finished that book, I said my next book is going to be a larger study of the posthumous legacy of Malcolm X. And what I argue, but what I show, I think, in the book is that for everything that Malcolm accomplished in his lifetime, and again, he, like King, was 39 when he was assassinated in 1965. In order to understand the place he has in American history and in the American imagination today, you can't just study what happened during his life. You have to actually study what happened after he was assassinated. And that arguably he's had an even bigger influence in the 60 years since his death than he had even during his life, right? So it starts with his influence on Black Power, on the Black arts movement, on athletes like Muhammad Ali, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, John Carlos. Then it picks up in the 80s with his rediscovery by a new generation of hip hop pioneers. And then you have Spike Lee's movies, not only the biopic starring Denzel Washington that everybody remembers, but even the role that Malcolm and the comparison between Malcolm and Dr. King play in Do the Right Thing. And then, of course, that was accompanied by all of the sales of X hats and merchandise and so forth. And the influence continues into this century, everything from his influence on Barack Obama, which President Obama wrote about in his memoir, Dreams from My Father, to his influence on the Black Lives Matter movement. And even, there was an opera that was written by a Black composer, Anthony Davis, in the 80s, but was revived a few years ago in a new production with all of these Afrofuturist themes, and so which kind of made Malcolm relevant even to the Black Panther generation, right? So that's the thesis and the story of my book.
Yeah. So it seems I'm having technical difficulties, but I want to give me some examples. I'm a big fan of the Black Arts movement. Hakeem Adabudi founded Third World Press, and some of the other, Amir Baraka, and some of the others during that time period. And they all talk about that influence of Malcolm, his use of language, words, and that sort of thing. Can you give some additional kind of ideas about not just the Black Arts movement, but also as we move forward, the civil rights movement you mentioned, and then the hip hop?
Yeah, well, so obviously Amir Baraka was one of his, primary, and he writes in his own autobiography, and I talk in the book about how even before Malcolm was assassinated, how listening to Malcolm, being inspired by Malcolm, played a role in Baraka's decision when he was still known as Leroy Jones to start focusing more on being a playwright than a poet, because he thought that was sort of, more relevant, socially relevant medium. Then after literally the week after Malcolm was assassinated, he moves from Greenwich Village to Harlem and starts the Black Arts Repertory Theater and School in Harlem, which becomes a model for all of these arts programs, theater, poetry, educational programs in Black communities around the country. He even before August Wilson knew who he was, and he was still trying to be a poet in Pittsburgh before he became a playwright. He was heavily influenced by Malcolm X. I write about Larry Neal, who was sort of the philosopher of the Black Arts movement, Maya Angelou, and on, and musicians, John Coltrane and others. But the point to make about that era, which I think then carries on into the hip hop era, even today, is that one of the reasons that I think Malcolm is so interesting and has remained so relevant is, he has a political message that we all remember and celebrate, and is associated with concepts like by any means necessary and so forth. But he far more than Dr. King or other civil rights leaders of that era, who were mostly focused on, law, legislation, and voting. Malcolm, believed that for Black folks to truly, sort of realize their full potential in this country, that even before you got to this political struggle, there was a psychological liberation that had to happen. Black folks had to celebrate themselves, stop thinking of themselves as Negroes, stop buying into kind of the white society's preconceptions about Black folks, but then also to celebrate their culture, to know their history, his Malcolm's parents. His father was killed when he was very young. His mother was eventually had to, be hospitalized for mental illness. But they were nationalists. They were followers of Marcus Garvey, who believed that Black folks, in order to escape their persecution in this country, had to go to another country. Malcolm said, no, we're staying here, but his nationalism was a cultural nationalism. It said, we want to stay here. We want to, assert our rights to be equal citizens, but we also want to have our own distinctive culture. So that was sort of just philosophically what was behind the Black arts movement. And then you see another version of that with hip hop 20 years later.
So I guess you got me back. I was in the background listening, and
Patrick seems to have.
Yeah, he's just an amazing conversation. But I know you have mentioned his mother, Louise Little.
Yes.
And I don't think we oftentimes talk about the impact the mother made and the reflection about the mothers. Um, they did a book about the three mothers, the mothers of James Baldwin, as well as the mothers of Dr. Martin Luther King, and the mother of Malcolm X, Louise Little, who you mentioned is from Grenada.
Yeah.
But how do you bring the impact of his mother, his movie, his life into your book, The Women? How do you bring that into your book? Because he's talked so candidly the preservation of the Black woman.
Yeah, no, his mother's a fascinating figure. So, tragic because she was, became a widow at a young age with all of the children to raise, and there was cheated out of an insurance settlement after her husband died, but. And honestly, we don't know. So there's one version of Louise Little that you see and read about in the autobiography, right?
Right.
Which is very poignant, but and focuses on just the heartbreak, Malcolm's heartbreak at kind of losing her to her at a certain point, not even being able to recognize him. And that's one of the reasons I think partly, he was sort of abandoned and eventually, left. He had moved they had moved when he was young, from Nebraska to Michigan. And then in the 8th grade, after his mother has this can no longer really sort of function, he moves to Boston to live with his half sister, Ella Collins,
right,
another formidable woman.
Yes.
But what we've learned now, which we and subsequent historians have really gone deeper into her influence and talked to his siblings, to Malcolm's brothers. And we learned that actually a lot of what we associate with Malcolm, first of all, just his sheer intelligence, also his, good looks, but also this emphasis on dignity and pride. A lot of that came from his mother.
Right. Exactly.
I mean, she was actually his father was a preacher, and had other side jobs, but his mother was even better educated than his father.
Exactly.
And so there's no video of her or evidence, documentation of her talking and so forth. But I'm pretty sure that if that existed today, you would say, oh, I see where he got that from.
I bring the reason why I bring it up because I'm looking at you talking about the afterlife and the impact on hip hop culture, and then we bring it to contemporary times, knowing how Malcolm X was passionate about his mother, how passionate about the presence of women, and how impactful women are to education. Mm-hmm. And so he said that quite a few times in his speeches. And now we get to hip hop culture, which is embodying Malcolm X, to now degrading the woman. So it seems like there has been a ideological shift. and I hope that I know.
Well, I what I write about is he was, obviously hip hop has had different strands and
Right.
different, right? And so Malcolm comes in the very first, at least commercial hip hop artists, like the Sugar Hill Gang and so forth, right? We're not particularly political, right?
Right.
They started the whole sort of braggadocio sort of tradition, but and it's really you start to sort of have more political hip hop in the mid to late '80s with groups like Public Enemy, right?
Right. Exactly.
And they were the first. Well, actually, you have Public Enemy, you have KRS-One, and then you have Tupac Shakur, who all within just a few years are not only incredibly successful commercially, become national national stars, but are also introducing a political message with Malcolm as not only invoked in their lyrics, but often they would take snippets of his speeches,
right,
and sample them, right, in their songs, right? So then you have, and Tupac was kind of a figure, he started out being more political and then he became more gangster. So then you have like the whole phase of hip hop that becomes more misogynistic, more gangster, and et cetera, et cetera. But then, in recent decades, you have the rise of all of these female rappers, right? And they've gone back to find the message of Malcolm that was very much pro female and feminist, right? He gives this famous eulogy in 1962. There was a brother at in the mosque in LA. There was a run-in with police who got shot, and he flew out to LA, held a press conference, and then spoke at his funeral. You can watch the whole thing. It's like 40 minutes long on YouTube. It's unbelievable.
Right.
But in the middle of that, he talks about how, no one has been victimized more. No one has been, disadvantaged more than the black woman. It's a very strong statement. So that Beyonce has sampled that speech in her songs. When Megan Thee Stallion was on SNL right after COVID, she stopped in the middle of her song and that soundbite from Malcolm played. So it's all there. I mean, that's what's fascinating, is that you can go back with Malcolm and you can find all of this stuff that he was saying over 60 years ago, which still seems so relevant today. Other figures, I mean, even Dr. King, I mean, as much as we admire him, it feels like he's talking, it doesn't feel like he's talking us, like right to us today. Whereas Malcolm, feels like he could be right there, in the room with you.
Seems like Patrick is still it. So hopefully he could come back and join the conversation, because you're dropping a lot of nuggets with us as we move forward. I wanted to stop you there because you did mention his wife, and I'll segue to some of the things that I actually talked about and you had brought up about the speech in LA. I think that was in 1962. So
62,
yeah. May 22nd. I just talked about that last night on a panel. So it's amazing that you called. I do want to now segue. I had some of my own questions just in case this happened, but I do want to talk about, I think if I recall, you mentioned his assassination and the impact of his assassination. And I know there was a lot of problem between the Nation of Islam and who was responsible for the assassination of Malcolm X. And
so about 2/3 of my book is on his cultural and political legacy and all the people he influenced, which we've been talking about. But I would say about 1/3 of it, I come back to it. I start with it, and then I have a couple of chapters in the middle of the book, and then towards the end of the book, where I also look into the whole question of who killed him and how long it took for all the truth of that to come out. and we don't even know if it's still fully out.
Mm-hmm.
So what happened was he was assassinated in the Audubon Ballroom in northern in New York City in February 1965. There was one of the gunmen was apprehended at the scene,
Mm-hmm.
and he turns out he came from Newark, New Jersey. From Paterson, New Jersey.
Mm-hmm.
But the NYPD was still convinced, even though they had somebody who, was right there, who came from Paterson, that the assassination had been organized out of the Nation of Islam mosque in Harlem. So then within a couple of weeks, they pick up 2 Fruit of Islam security members of the security force from the Harlem mosque and arrest them. A year later, there was a trial. All 3 of those men were convicted.
Mm-hmm.
So one of them was guilty. The guy from Paterson was part of the hit squad. The other 2 were innocent the whole time.
Right.
And the guy from Paterson actually, during the trial, changed his testimony to say these other 2 weren't involved. But then when he was pressed on the stand to identify who his accomplices were, who else was involved, he wouldn't do it. So they end up all getting sentenced to life in prison. Under the parole laws, they're eventually eligible for parole. The 2 men who were wrongfully convicted eventually get out after a combined 42 years, but they're still, have these felony convictions over their heads. And by the within a decade, by the late 70s, it was even more evidence was coming out about who the other gunmen were. There were 4 others, and they all came from either Paterson or Newark. But despite the fact that this evidence had been unearthed by a lawyer named William Kunstler and by a journalist named Peter Goldman, who tried to get the case reopened, the officials would not reopen the case. So fast forward, that's 1979, 1980. Almost 40 years later, it took before the documentary filmmakers who made a film that you can watch on Netflix to this day called Who Killed Malcolm X,
Mm-hmm.
went in search of one of the gunmen who had fired the shotgun that actually killed, fired the fatal shots that killed him, was a man who had served time but then gotten out of prison, turned his life around, and was living in plain sight in
New
Newark.
Jersey. It was in New Jersey.
In Newark. And everybody in the community in Newark knew who he was and knew that he had killed Malcolm. But people sort of kept quiet about it. And so the documentary filmmakers gathered all this evidence. They were going to confront him with his past, and then he died in the middle of the making of that film. So they turned the film more into a film about how and why these other 2 men had been wrongfully convicted. So that the evidence that was accumulated for that documentary finally led the district attorney in New York to reopen and reinvestigate the case. And in 2021, right, 55 years after the conviction, the 2 wrongfully convicted men were officially exonerated. One of them didn't live to see it; he had died. Only one of them was still alive. So I tell that whole story in my book as well. In addition to the questions that still are unanswered about how much the FBI in particular knew about the plot.
And that's an interesting point that you bring up, because the reason why he felt that the FBI was impacted, because I believe he was flying over to France, and they would not let him land because they did not want to be responsible for the death or whatever happened to Malcolm X. So that triggered that it was something more than the Nation of Islam involved, or wanted him to be assassinated or wanted his life.
Yeah, I mean, I go through all of that. I mean, it's not entirely clear. So there's some people who are absolutely convinced that somehow the CIA was involved, the FBI, the NYPD. We don't know. I mean, what we do know is that there were a lot of people who were after Malcolm. He was definitely being surveyed by both the FBI and the CIA.
Oh, yeah.
There were elements in France who, France was allied. France had been this colonial power in Africa. And they were still allied with more conservative leaders in Africa who viewed Malcolm as a threat because, he was trying to make common cause with, leaders like Nkrumah and Nasser in Egypt, who were more radical. So there were people. There were conservative African influences who probably wanted Malcolm out of the way. There were other elements. And then there was almost a competition going on it was very clear. I mean, some people say that the assassination had to have been ordered by Elijah Muhammad from Chicago. Well, real students of the Nation of Islam will say Elijah Muhammad definitely wanted Malcolm out of the way, but he also didn't want his fingerprints on it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what he essentially set up with some of his own cryptic statements, but also by more direct things that were said to the various mosques and to the security forces around the country by his son, not his oldest son, Wallace, who took over later,
yeah.
but Elijah Jr., where he almost said, we want this, they called him the hypocrite, the chief hypocrite. We want this hypocrite taken care of, but somebody's got to do it for us, right? So there's evidence that there was, the Harlem Mosque tried to take him out. They firebombed his house. That didn't work. That there was a squad from Philadelphia that was trying to go after him. So it's not like there was only one assassination plot. It just so happened that the one that was carried out, if not, even if there were other people involved, that was carried out, we know for a fact by a squad from Newark. It just happened that they succeeded. But if they hadn't succeeded, there were other hit squads that were after him as well.
Now, if you guys are just now tuning in, we are talking to Mark Whitaker about the afterlife of Malcolm X. Mr. Whitaker, now you opened up a can of worms, so I am going to have to go there. I think I baited you into this.
Okay.
And so we talked about France. I brought France into the conversation.
Mm.
But it's interesting, you added on to his impact and his travel into Africa. Even though we're focused on the afterlife of Malcolm X, he still had a really impactful global impact. So because you said Africa, because you brought this conversation up, I do have to talk about Burkina Faso and his excellency. Ibrahim Traore. Traore. And he is doing a lot of work. And when he speaks, he just spoke at the Sputnik Africa, because he was in Russia.
Mm-hmm.
And he has a lot of the ideology of Malcolm X in terms of Pan-Africanism, in terms of supporting one another, in terms of socio-economic independence.
Yeah.
Do you want to speak on that a little bit?
Yeah,
I know
so
you
it's
probably
really
don't
interesting.
cover a lot.
Here's, I mean, I think, it's well known, and it's the last part of the autobiography that after Malcolm goes to prison in his, I think he was 20 years old when he was sentenced to prison. He spent 6 years in prison. He gets out and he becomes for a decade really the most visible figure in the Nation of Islam, and sort of, even though he was in charge of the mosque in New York, he was also traveled around the country giving speeches, was the most visible. But then in the last year, he leaves the Nation of Islam, and well, actually, he was he was sort of kicked out for a variety of reasons. There was the pretext was that he said this after President Kennedy was assassinated. He famously said, "This was chickens coming home to roost."
Exactly.
Elijah Muhammad was angry at him for that statement and suspended him. There was really other stuff going on. Malcolm had discovered that Elijah Muhammad was committing adultery with a number of his young assistants. There was also a dispute about his house in Queens. And I get into all of that in the book. But he then goes out on his own. And he travels, he makes pilgrimage to Mecca. He travels across Africa and Europe. He meets with heads of state wherever he goes. He comes back to Harlem and launches a new organization called the Organization of Afro-American Unity.
Mm-hmm.
And the question has remained, because that phase was so short. It was only less than a year after he left the Nation of Islam that he was assassinated.
Mm-hmm.
Where was he going in that last year? He clearly was evolving. He talked about it himself.
Mm-hmm.
But in what direction, right? So there's one view which I think was encouraged by Alex Haley, who was the ghostwriter of the autobiography, that where Malcolm was going was in sort of a more moderate direction, where eventually if he had lived, he might have formed an alliance with Dr. King and the mainstream civil rights leaders, right? And they did meet once on Capitol Hill in 1964. And it was a cordial meeting, and so there is some evidence for that argument.
Mm-hmm.
But what Malcolm also did in that last year was to really focus much more on this Pan-African message, right? Which was basically what Black folks needed to do in order to be in the strongest possible position, even within the United States, was to form common cause with all of these with Black folks around the world who were in the process of winning their independence, and asserting their power, that the racial struggle in America had to be globalized, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that was very clear. I mean, there is, whether he would have formed an alliance with Dr. King was more speculation. What is absolutely clear is that he believed in this global. He had this project. He wanted to bring the treatment of Blacks in America before the United Nations, at a time when the United Nations was considered much more influential and powerful than it is today. So that's and the organization, even the name of his organization, the Organization of Afro-American Unity, was modeled after the Organization of African Unity, which he had, witnessed in Africa and spoken to and so forth. So it was very much it's interesting because in the white imagination at the time, and even now, he is so associated with this idea of violence. He was not an advocate of violence. He was an advocate of self-defense, right? But that sort of suggests, that Black folks are in opposition. But in fact, he was really, particularly in the last year of his life, he was looking for alliances, right? But even before any potential alliances with other civil rights groups in America, the first alliance he wanted to make was with Black folks around the world.
And that just really speaks to just his transformation, in terms of who he became, and understanding that it is bigger to fight this inhumanity that was going on with a lot of African people. He needed to embrace anybody who would give a willing hand, but still at the same time was concerned about the leaders that were involved. So
yeah, and that it was a human rights. The other thing he said is it's not just a racial struggle. It's a human rights struggle. It's global and it's human rights, right? And so the last speech that he finished was 3 days before he was assassinated. It was at Barnard College in Manhattan. It's the women's college that's sort of the sister college to Columbia University. And so it was an audience of predominantly white students and faculty, the majority of them female. But he still thought it was important to go talk to that group to say, what I am focused on now, and he said it very explicitly in the speech, I have this at the end of my book, I am not here to tell you about the racial struggle. I am here to tell you about the global human rights struggle. That around the world, there's a struggle between the oppressors and the oppressed. And we are on the side of everybody who is being oppressed. And so he had come to a point where he didn't just see it as an American struggle, and he didn't even just see it as a Black struggle. He saw it as a global human rights struggle.
So I want to tell anybody that they can learn more, and they can, pick up your book. They can pick up your book from the Doc Bookshop, either online, in store, because there's so much to it, and it's so timely. And it is so important, especially when we deal with the degradation that's going on in a lot of communities across America. And as we try to reclaim our values and our value system, I think there is a foundation of truth that we all need to embrace. And I think you give that to us in a generation that knows not. And some generations that know what they can be doing or not doing. I think it's by no coincidence that when Malcolm X did his first speech in front of a bookstore in New York, that today we are challenged with carrying out his books, his letters, his legacy through writing, through authors like you that continue to do the research and unearth all the information that Malcolm has. He just has a plethora. In his 39 years, he has done so much work. And I want to
my book opens, you'll be glad to know, it opens with him speaking outside of that bookstore. That is the first
yes.
Louis Michaud's famous African nationalist bookstore.
So I thought it was very important. And when I saw that, I said, and this was a while ago, they given me the information. I said, we somehow have got to get this journalist on the Doc Bookshop and just really, get organized with contemporary thinkers. And the evaluation that you did is just so much work. I think this is something that groups and organizations need to come. If you are a group out there, I think this is going to be a tremendous read. Please get this book for your group or your organization, and we will be happy to host a conversation in the bookstore. It is lots of information, lots of research went into this. I do want to, if people want to write you or talk to you, how can they reach out to you?
So I have a website. It's mark-whitaker.com. And you can go on there. You can find out more about the book, about my other books, about my appearances, some of the work I've done, TV work, some of the things I've written. And there's also contact information, my email, and how to reach my book publicist, all that information. So it's Whitaker, 1T Whitaker.com.
Definitely, let me go over here and see it. Definitely. I want to thank everybody that tuned in. Mark, if you have any last thing you could tell the youth, the young people out there, what would you say to them as we come to Malcolm X's 100th birthday?
So what I would say is, one of the reasons he is an icon, and he's become a bigger and bigger icon over time, is that he seems so relevant, and I hope everybody reads my book and enjoys it. But thanks now to the internet and YouTube and so forth, you can go on and you can watch his speeches.
Right.
And I think I would say study not just what he says, because I think it's still, it seems very, very contemporary in terms of his messages, and it speaks to today's times, but also study the way he says it, right? Because he was an unbelievable communicator, right? And he spoke, with fearlessness and passion, but also in a way that was direct. He could talk to anybody. He could talk to people in the streets. He could talk to people in universities. He could go on radio and TV shows and debate his critics. He had a sense of humor, and there's a great phrase from John Carlos, who was one of the sprinters who staged the famous protests of the 1968 Olympics.
And he came to the store. John Carlos went to the store.
Yeah, well, he was, he grew up in Harlem, and he used to follow Malcolm X around when he was a teenager. And he said, he has this great line, he said that Malcolm grabbed hold of my frustrations and turned them into logic.
Wow.
Right? And so when you listen to Malcolm X speak, you think, he was portrayed as like a scary figure. So you expect that you're going to see somebody shouting and being, but actually he just breaks it down, he had that ability to say these incredibly strong things, but just in this calm, intelligent, almost irrefutable way. So anybody who's any of the young folks out there who are interested in activism, in politics, in media, study Malcolm X. Study the way he communicates.
Thank you so much. I just think we're probably going to be diving into your literary work probably for the rest of the year. All the way, I know at least up to Juneteenth. So I think we're going to really embrace that and encourage people on the many different programs that we're going to be in Juneteenth to pick up this book and share that with your family, share that with your organizations. And I thank you so much for joining us today. And Patrick apologizes. So I'm just happy I was ready to go. But truly,
thank you. Bless you for everything you're doing, and thank you for supporting authors. We really appreciate it.
And you guys go to the docbookshop.com and pick up your copy, or come in store and pick up your copy. I look forward to meeting you, seeing you, and exchanging conversation.
Next time I'm in the Dallas Fort Worth area, I will definitely come and say hello.
All right. Thanks to all. Thank you, everyone.
Okay. Thanks, everybody.